Okay, so that takes us on to how well did the Constitution deal with the problems of creating a new government for the USA? So that one, and then Federalists, anti-Federalists. So I put down the three biggest factors are the balance of power, states versus federal rights, and slavery. So I think these are the three big issues. And again, it's the question is whether they dealt with them, how they dealt with them. Was it positive? Was it negative? And I think this one, unlike the Articles of Federation, I think you can really go either way. And a lot of that is down to whether you're framing it on again, that short-term versus long-term contributions. So in terms of the balance of power, so in terms of the positives, presidency became an elected monarch. So they had more power than George III and could deal with problems. Given the fact the Articles of Confederation had no real leadership, I think the idea that they created a presidency that could do that, had like one voice that could then guide and deal with the problems they were facing. But at the same time, they created the other federal branches of the Supreme Court and Congress that balanced out the
Yeah,
president. So that
it's
Congress could
it's
set. Oh yeah, go on.
it, yeah, it's important to I think just to distinguish though, because if you say elected monarch, it's a little vague, isn't it? What elected monarch
That was the
means.
initial plan of Hamilton,
So
though, elected monarch.
yeah, yeah, right. But the president is much more powerful in foreign affairs. All right, as the commander in chief, there's a lot of scope.
Was that clear at the
Um,
time? Because I think that's true now, but they've taken a lot of powers from that, and I think it's mainly because Congress is only interested in domestic stuff. They didn't really care or think about what the president was doing abroad.
Yeah, that's a very good point. So, of course, America is still, Washington's famous policy in regards to foreign affairs in Europe is to stay the hell out of it. Do not get involved, right?
Mm-hmm.
But that said, in theory, still, I mean, the Constitution gives the presidency tremendous scope in foreign affairs. That's also in terms of negotiations, right? So Congress can declare war, but in terms of domestic matters, well, presidential authority is much more limited.
Yeah,
He just has the power of veto.
he can select his
Um,
own executive government as well, like advisors. Although that wasn't in the Constitution, Washington took that power,
yeah,
and
but
that
I
comes
just want
down
to
to
I just want to say that because elected monarch could seem like you can just kind of get put forth a decree and whether it's domestic or foreign and it has to be followed. It's not really like that. Although that said, the modern executive order is a kind of you know, much
yeah.
closer to a monarchical decree these days. But this is something you don't have to worry about executive orders yet.
No, 20th century is where the
This is a
president
20th
gets a
century
lot of
thing.
power on. Yeah, because
Yeah,
I don't think they really
because
care.
because the important thing is that this is very interesting, right? One thing that the founders really got wrong, I think, in the structure is that they assumed each of the powers would be very jealous over its authority and would try to continually expand it,
Yeah,
right? So the presidency would try to expand it. The legislature, that's Congress, would try to expand, um, and the court's another issue, particularly in the Constitution. So there's actually a nuance there. I thought I should mention it. It doesn't say that in the book, but the
mm-hmm.
Constitution, of course, does not explicitly give the court the right to strike down legislation.
Well, its role is not
That's
clear
actually
because they
that's
saw it
actually
as the least important of the branches, the least
yes,
serious branches.
they did, which is another actually, yeah, which is time has proven them incorrect with that one too. But there's a case that happens. It's called Marbury versus Madison that actually establishes judicial
Yeah.
review. I'm sorry, but that's just a digression. So they thought that each of the powers would be jealous and would try to expand its authority. And actually, what happened? What happened was that in fact Congress is meant to be the real, I think, locus of sovereignty. Would you say it's the legislature, right?
Yeah, because it's the vested in the people, isn't it? So that's the idea.
That's really the critical thing, Congress. And now, if you notice, if you follow American politics, you'll notice actually that everyone's attention is focused on the president, not on Congress. Congress has a lot of issues passing laws these days.
Media.
Media.
To focus on one person than 300. So,
do you want to? Is it important to outline the concept of the balance of power, James, or
that they run through? Well, I think it is really important, but so the idea, now put down, the Congress could check the president, but the president could veto Congress, and the Supreme Court did declare laws unconstitutional, so prevents one being dominant. The idea of the balancing each other out. But the key, I think, the fundamental key point of this, and the real positive of the Constitution, was the idea that the Constitution, and with it the Bill of Rights, is superior to all three branches. And that was unique, because putting a document above the active people was the real key locker into making sure that this was not a problem, because then it didn't matter if one branch got more power, because they're still limited by the Constitution. The Constitution was above everything, and the Constitution was something they agreed on. So putting that up on the top. So the idea, obviously, the Constitution was protected by the Supreme Court, but the president would appoint the Supreme Court, but the Senate could veto. So like all the institutions designed behind it was there to make sure that they would lock each other up, that no one branch could dominate the other one.
That's right. So what the idea of the balance of power is that what you want to prevent is one branch being able to subvert all of the others and basically effectively render them powerless, right? So you could imagine the most obvious case: the president gets control of the courts, gets control of, he gets his cronies in the courts, right? Stacks the courts.
That's what they're arguing now.
No, I don't want to make any modern parallel.
Well, FDR is the biggest one. He wanted to create 7 more Supreme Court justices because he was being blocked court back.
I know.
Yeah.
Tell me about it. Okay, and then you could subvert. He could subvert the authority of Congress and start making laws in his own name. So basically, the path to really absolute power. And if you think that's not a problem, look at other countries that have this system where it hasn't worked quite so well, like Mexico. Right? So the problem, the issue of one power dominating, taking over the rest, is a real one. It's a big problem. And what they're trying to do in the system is to play each power off against the other, so that no one interest can kind of become overwhelmingly dominant. Right. So powers constantly divided. You have a president, but president can only have the power of veto. He can't propose law, right?
Yeah.
But if you go to Congress, Congress is divided between the Senate, which is 2 representatives for each state, right?
Yeah.
And then the House of Representatives, which is proportionately elected depending on population. Okay, so those two things check each other. And then you have the courts, and then you have state and federal government. So you have this, basically it's a macrocosm. You have another system, each state has its own divided powers as well, and the states and the federal government are also played off against each other, right? So you divide interests to such an extent that it's very difficult for one individual person or a party to become to take all of the reins of power, right? When you have, ultimate power is when you have the legislative, the executive, judicial in the hands of one person or one group.
Yeah, it's funny though, they weren't really worried about, their only real concern was the presidency dominating this, which is again that fear of despotic government. I think they didn't really have a worry. I mean, I suppose some of them
you don't think that's why that they divided the legislative branch?
They didn't. I don't think they felt Congress, and especially they felt the Supreme Court was going to be the one that became dominant.
Yeah.
They
Obviously,
didn't
the
anticipate how these things would
presidency is
evolve.
a big one. Yeah.
Yeah. And the idea, I think, behind it was that many people had feared an elective dictatorship from an elected monarch. And that was one of the fears. And that I think is the Bill of Rights' role. So the Bill of Rights' role was to eliminate that fear from those who had it. I don't think it was
But,
everyone.
but it's also to eliminate the fear that the federal government would tyrannize over the state government, right?
Yeah, but
Which
when
isn't
they
quite the
thought
same.
that,
It's
I
not
don't
quite the
think they
same
thought,
thing.
but I don't, even then, I don't think they thought Congress would be doing that. I think they thought it would be the president because they still haven't quite got in their head that Parliament was the
No,
one.
I think they did, but that's exactly right. Isn't it really Parliament that was, I put inverted commas, tyrannizing over
It was, but
the colonists?
I still don't think they've got that in their head. I still think they think it's I still think they
I think,
fear,
yeah.
like especially among the ordinary population, still towards the idea of a monarch. And of course, some of them wanted a monarch. I mean, Washington and Hamilton and that talked about having a monarchy because they thought it was the only
There's a lot
monarch.
of talk about what he should be called, what his title is, right?
But they were literally discussing bringing in the monarchy as well, and the idea of some of them were like, we need to bring an aristocracy in, like have titles like lords,
Yeah,
like a house of lords,
yeah,
effectively the elites overrunning
that's
it.
yeah.
And that was obviously not favored by the Jeffersonian wing of this debate.
But just remember, in the English Civil War, you have Parliament wins, right? And
Yeah.
then you have a military dictatorship that's set up out of the.
Well, George III didn't believe that Washington would put the army aside. I mean, the world was shocked that he stepped aside after. I mean, look, Napoleon in the French Revolution.
Yeah, there's something very important about Washington and his personality, his ability to stand above
Yeah.
kind of party conflicts, to be able to adjudicate and to be respected by both sides.
Yeah, because that's
I
the
think
problem. In
that's
the
very
Haitian
extreme.
Revolution, in the French Revolution, in the British Civil War, all of them ended up with effective dictatorships, and America
Yeah.
didn't.
No.
And that is their exceptionalism. There are very few examples of revolutions that don't end up with a dictator.
Yeah. That's right.
I think that's when we get to the Washington essay and how significant he was. That's really important in his character. I mean, it's kind of like you take it for granted, but if you look at it, literally Napoleon was just after us in the French Revolution. He ended up taking over. You had both the things that, in fact, the two things they were afraid of. The Hamiltonian wing was afraid of a popular democracy, tyranny of the masses, which is exactly what you got with the French terror and the guillotining of all of the elites. And the
And then
Jeffersonian
Napoleon.
and the Jeffersonian wing was afraid of a dictator, absolute power coming to ride, which is exactly what you got with Napoleon. So if you look at the French Revolution, you ended up with both of those extremes that Hamilton and Jefferson were afraid of. And in the American compromise, you got neither of those.
Right.
At least not to the same extent as in France.
Right. So yeah. So can I just give the students a tip?
Yeah.
If you're interested in balance of power and you want to clarify it, I really recommend reading Federalist 51. Okay? That's the Federalist 51 is Madison's account of
from the Federalist Papers.
What's the philosophy? What's the theory? Why have balance of power? I think 51
of the Federalist Papers.
Of the Federalist Papers lays that out quite clearly. It's only like 4 or 5 pages, I think, so it's not a big read.
Madison is somewhat of a genius, though. I mean, the ability of some of these founding fathers is quite insane. They were forming their
astonishing. Yeah, they're astonishing in there. Yeah.
But Madison, especially because he was on both sides, you know what I mean? He recognized the dangers all over the place. He gets not much credit given his position. Like,
I think Hamilton's actually the greatest.
Yeah, Hamilton's my favorite.
Just in terms of sheer intellect, I think Hamilton could take them all. He could basically take them all on, as he did once.
I think Madison is at the same level. I don't think he had as forceful a personality as Hamilton. That's why Jefferson argued that side. You know what I mean? Jefferson came to represent that side rather than Madison. But I think that thing is Hamilton combined an intellect with a strong personality as well, whereas I think Madison just had the intellectual side.
Yes, yeah.
And
Yeah.
Jefferson had the stronger personality. Although not that he wasn't an intellect. I don't think he was at the same level.
No.
So obviously then the positives of balance of power created a stronger federal government that could deal with the problem. So it could tax, it could wage war, it could have an army, it could make foreign treaties, it could end revolts. So this new power base would allow them to deal with all the problems that they failed to deal with in the Articles of Confederation.
So if I could put it again, this is something that John Locke says. He's a philosopher that the founders read avidly. Next to, I think it's probably the most important next to Montesquieu. Locke said, you want a very powerful government, but it needs to be limited.
Yeah.
So how do you have powerful government that's limited, that's not going to it's not going to transgress the boundaries that have been set for it? That is basically the theoretical challenge in a nutshell of what they're doing here. Strong government, but strong government that will only act within the bounds that have been set for it.
Yeah, but the problem is, in reality, it meant instead of compromise and cooperation, often it's in stalemate, nothing getting done. So I believe it was a constitution set up to create a government. I think the intention was to create a government that does nothing unless absolutely necessary.
But they wouldn't have done that if you have a unitary executive. I mean, this again is in the Federalist Papers about the fact that the executive has to be vigorous.
Yeah.
So it's not that everything has to be slow. I think what the founders wanted was difficulty in proposing legislation. So you need you need coalitions to get legislation through.
And 2/3 if the president vetoes.
2/3.
And
right.
And
but once it's passed, once you have a law, once a bill gets through, then you have a very efficient and strong executive branch that can enforce it, right? That's the name of the executive, right? Why is he called the executive? He's the executive because he executes the will of the legislature.
Yeah. Although in the end, he ended up executing his own will, we were saying, because he wasn't supposed to have advisors. He was supposed to be consulted by the Senate. But Washington created his own executive body of cabinet positions.
Yeah. Sorry.
And took Jefferson and Hamilton, most talented people, into that coalition, which is automatically going to strengthen the federal position. And it's the irony that even Jefferson, who was anti-presidential power, basically became Secretary of State and then president.
But this goes up and down. I think that it's very tempting to read the modern contemporary situation of American government into the past. But in fact, if you look at the history, the fortunes of the presidency have waxed and waned. And after the Civil War, for example, in the 19th century, that really was the kind of honeymoon period of Congress. The presidents in that period were rather they just didn't do very much.
Well, there was the laissez-faire,
consequential.
Yeah, they didn't want to. They were kind of lazy.
No, they didn't want to. So it's not true. It's definitely not true. I'd avoid assuming that all of us, immediately the presidency becomes the big thing.
No, but that was their fear. But do you think they dealt well? So then we have to do how well did the Constitution deal with the problems creating? So did the balance of power deal with it well?
That's such a massive question.
One they've got to answer. So it's like,
I mean, if I was going to write an essay on it, I would say it would do well. I think it's easier to extol the virtues of the system that they've created, which is an ingenious system.
Yeah, given the divisions, because you've got to fundamentally factor in this country was divided in an unbelievable number of different ways, and yet they managed to get this through.
The fact that that's the problem. You have to constantly bear in mind that the condition for all of this is the agreement of the states.
Yeah.
Right?
To agreement
of a bunch of people who are really, really cynical, really scared of some kind of absolute power.
Yep.
Right. So it's got to be a compromise. It's not like Plato's Republic where you just, Socrates comes up with this ideal system and then you try to implement it or whatever. It's a compromise from the beginning, and compromises usually, are difficult things. So as a compromise, it's a remarkable one.
But they did get around that by making sure that they had constitutional conventions to ratify in the states and not the state legislatures themselves, because their turkeys don't vote for Christmas.
Well, that's the most incredible thing of all, is the fact that it wasn't even advertised as so. It wasn't advertised as the Constitutional Convention. They thought they were trying to amend the Articles of Confederation. Suddenly, out of that, you get a new constitution.
But they did.
It's very strange.
They amended it into something functional.
It's almost like they tricked people into it.
I'm sure a few of them had that in mind when they went there.
Yeah. Okay.
And
anyway,
the quality of the founding fathers and the people that were at this meeting to construct this document is insane, because we think this is obvious now because a lot of these things are things we see all around the world, but this was new. None of this had been done before.
It was there. I mean, to be fair, it's there in theory. Like, read Montesquieu, read Locke.
Yeah, but it hadn't been done.
It hadn't been done. No, that's right. It hadn't been put into practice, and that's the incredible thing.
I mean, come on. If you think about the divisions in the country and the way they get able to overcome this, if they looked at the modern politicians and how their inability to overcome anything and come to any compromise, it's just like the quality is incredibly different.
What do you think you'd get these days?
Well, if the founding fathers came back, they were looking at it. I think they'd be disappointed by the quality of the discourse in American political life.
That's a very restrained response, James.
I think they'd have been disapproving of what they saw.
They'd be rolling around and tumbling in their graves, I think.
I don't think they'd be impressed.
Okay, so I'd say
they'd probably find the presidency too powerful. They'd probably think the presidency and the Supreme Court were more powerful than they thought they were, and they'd probably think Congress was useless because it is.
Yeah, that's a very complicated set of affairs. I don't want to go into it because it's not
different world as well. All right, so with balance of power, I also think balance of power. I think they did a good job. I mean, the idea was, it's like, what were they trying to set up? If you were arguing they were trying to set up a government to really be active and do stuff, then no, it didn't really work. But I don't think that was their intention. So I think, given that their intention was they had to create a system that what they were able to do is they could tax, they could raise an army, they could deal with the problems that they were dealing with then, and they created something that could evolve to deal, albeit sometimes slowly and sometimes a bit later, like slower than it should have done, but a system that could evolve to deal with any problems that came up in the future.
Yeah. So that's right. That's another incredibly difficult thing to do when you're implementing a system, right? Or you're creating one.
Mm-hmm.
How do you make your system stable, but at the same time malleable enough that it can adapt to different circumstances? That's massive. How to do that, because most of the time the system's either too rigid, so that you get a different set of circumstances and it destroys the system, can't cope.
Or the system can't adapt.
Or on the other hand, it's not strong enough, it's too adaptable, and so it gets overthrown or subverted because it's simply just not enough.
But I think that's where you've got the balance between Hamiltonian system. The Hamiltonian wing wanted a system that was strong enough to just do whatever it wanted, and the Jeffersonian one to resist that. And I think those two strains of proactive and reactive together in one document is quite a genius thing, because it meant that it can, if the public really shifts as it does, things change. There are amendments made to the Constitution when society gets there, but I think for progressives it's frustrating, because they have to, I think it frustrates both progressives and conservatives, which is probably why it's such a good document, because progressives are frustrated that it takes longer to get there, and conservatives are frustrated that things change. But I think that it kind of means things change in America when critical mass is reached in the popular design behind it. And because it's so slow, it can't be reaction. It can't be like just, knee-jerk reactionary. It doesn't work that way.
But we're in a very different situation now. Again, in contemporary politics, power of Congress has diminished significantly. Power of presidency has increased through executive orders, particularly in domestic affairs. And because America has a global, it's a number one global power, and the president is commander in chief, that's massive, right? And the court has become so, because legislation is so difficult to get legislation through, except in massive omnibus packages, right?
Mm.
You can jam through in these massive, like hundreds and hundreds of pages of just different things all combined together for like the budget. It's so hard to get. It's executive orders and to some extent the Supreme Court decisions now. That's very strange, but that's complicated, James, because there's a whole lot of things that happen on the way that I don't think the founders really anticipated. We're still in really classical liberalism in the 18th century. And one very obvious thing, just to make this clear, is that there's no welfare state here. Where's the healthcare? Where's the
you could argue there isn't one in the modern American state, being a European either. But
and but there is. Let's face it. I mean, it's enormous, and it might not be effective. It's enormous.
It's crap and costs lots of money, which is.
But all of this stuff is later. All of this stuff is later. It's not there yet.
But that's why they left the gaps. A lot of it was to be filled in, but it allows that flexibility. Some stuff restricts down. All right. So states versus federal rights. They had that problem as well. How do they balance the state versus federal, as you talked about before? So all of them are represented. So obviously the small states were basically like, we don't want it on popular vote because we just get outvoted or invaded in the case of Rhode Island. And the big states were like, they didn't want it one vote per state or equal, because they'd seen that failing under the Articles of Federation, where Rhode Island has consistently blocked lots of initiatives. So they were like, eventually they came to a compromise, which was put forward, the idea being the Senate would have 2 senators each. So that made the small states happy, because they would be able to have similar influence. So nothing could be, the Senate would be the protectorate for the small states, and it is now as well, to block any laws that would override them. And the House of Representatives would be done on population. And this would mean that the larger states would have much more influence in the House of Representatives. So this was fundamentally important, because it allowed them to have the bigger states to have an influence in one chamber. And the fact that taxation was decided by the bigger chamber, by the House of Representatives, I think was really important, because it meant that population would determine financial issues, but the states, the Senate, would allow them to block stuff down. Obviously, the Senate was originally not elected by popular vote either, so that would make a difference in terms of doing it. Was selected by the states, nominated people to the Senate, so it would be the higher house. Though eventually that changed, but that division allowed that balance of states and federal rights for both sides to be clear. I think the problems were. You on?
Sorry, no.
I was going to say the problems with this. Oh God, I'm sorry. You go.
No, it's the connection. I'm sorry, because there's a short lag. Is it worth mentioning the electoral colleges?
Yeah, go on.
Oh, you go. Yeah.
So, well, you go mention the electoral college.
Well, the president's not directly elected.
No.
Right. So
that was the idea to create popular tyranny as well. So they would, and that would give a bulwark to the elites who would be nominated to the electoral college to be able to choose someone they thought was deserving of the post. The idea was to eliminate anyone whose character was deemed, not right for the republic.
I'm going to cough loudly.
Okay. Although it seems to have failed. This
is not meant to get political, James.
I know.
We're
not really supposed to have political opinions as teachers either, but never mind. We obviously do. The compromise. The negatives of this was the compromise between state and federal government was not clear and would lead to conflict in the future, especially in towards the Civil War. So they didn't really define exactly how clearly the difference between state and federal government would be. And that was fought over a lot in the Supreme Court with Plessy versus Ferguson and things we'll get into, like slaughterhouse cases and other stuff that we're going to talk about when we deal with the 20th century course. It also led to logjams in legislation because the two branches couldn't necessarily agree on things. So again, that slowed it down. It's not necessarily a bad or a good thing. You could argue either way, but it definitely led to logjams in legislation. And it would eventually contribute to the Civil War and be the subject of Supreme Court legislation.
Yeah, because it's important to remember that the problem of slavery, I mean, you've got that as the third point, but one issue in which that manifested was, of course, state versus federal rights.
Yeah.
Right. So
Yeah, although I think that comes a little later when that really kicks in. But I think the initial state versus federal rights was basically like, how are we going to get the states to sign up to them losing all their power without them having something? You know what I mean? So they were like, basically, we're only going to let the federal government do all the things that the Articles of Federation can't do, i.e. tax, raise an army, do stuff, and everything else will be fine. Of course, that wasn't clearly defined. So that battle is still battling to this day about where the division of power is on those 2 points, which is probably, I don't know, the idea whether the founding fathers wanted it to be this organic document that constantly keeps evolving, or whether they wanted it so rigid. I think they didn't want to tie it down quite so much because they probably knew things would change in the future. But I think, again, in the short term, you would argue that they dealt with the states versus federal rights pretty well because every state ratified it. But in the long term, they didn't. It led to more conflicts.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I would say too. I think the fact that it does get ratified is critical.
Yeah, they had to.
States are happy enough with it. The states are happy enough with it that it goes through.
Yeah,
they could have rejected it.
Yeah, and they would have done. I think if it wasn't designed so well, it would have been rejected. I mean, some states didn't sign up to it. It was touch and go if it was going to be ratified, even with this many compromises.
Rhode Island again. Those damn Rhode Island.
Yeah, well, yeah, they don't like it. They're holding out, and was it North Carolina as well? Took a while to.
Do you think they're proud of this in Rhode Island today? If you go, I actually haven't kind of driven through Rhode Island. I don't think I've been there.
I've been through on the chain. I met people from Rhode Island. They've always been a bit weird.
There's a Seinfeld episode with Miss Rhode Island.
Oh, really? Well, they had one.
I feel like we're in safe territory making fun of Rhode Island.
People in Rhode Island, the only ones I met in Paris, they were completely surprised at being English. I could speak English so well, and then they were asking me.
Well, I'm surprised at that too, James.
It's my Irish blood, I reckon. Maybe. The third factor was the slavery issue, obviously, as well, that they had to deal with. This was the big one. So they avoided a civil war over the issue, at least in the short term. So basically, there was real dangers that the country was going to split. They couldn't really, like I said, even at the time of ratification, there were more slave states than non-slave states, and the slave owning movement was still pretty strong. Slavery, they decided not to mention slavery in the Constitution to avoid these conflicts. That's how divisive the issue was. And they came up with the 3/5 compromise, and the fugitive slave provisions calmed the South down as well. So the idea that African Americans would count as 3/5 of a person, because obviously population determined your position in the House of Representatives. And the southern states had large African American populations. They were like, well, our state has this many people. And the North is like, yeah, but you don't count them as people, so therefore they don't count. And they came up with a 3/5 compromise, the idea that each slave would count as 3/5 of a person towards voting rights, although they obviously themselves would not be able to vote.
Because the South, if it had its way, would want each slave to count as one, right?
Well, yes,
as a voter, essentially.
Yeah. Whereas the North would have said them as 0. So I guess 3/5 means the South got a slight win.
Yeah, but just
60-40, which is about the slave versus non-slave ratio in the country at the time, slave-owning states.
Yeah.
Negatives of this is that this slavery not being mentioned in the Constitution is also negative, because it's obviously an issue they don't deal with. It's like Western expansion; they just kick it down the road. It's obviously an active contradiction with the Declaration of Independence, where all men are created equal and free, and they're clearly not in slavery. So this was contradicting that. Slave trading was allowed to continue for 20 more years of importing of slaves. That was to create a slow period. Then afterwards they would come out. But the southern states like Virginia and that were quite in favor of the ending of the slave trade, because they had excess slaves in their population from birth. And they knew if the other southern colonies and new colonies that would get slaves couldn't import it,
get a better price.
They would get a better price because they would be able to sell on their excess slaves. They were actually quite happy with this because it came up with a market for them. So they would have gone earlier. Jefferson described it as the fireball in the night that was going to end up destroying the country and tearing it in half. And of course, he was not wrong when about 70 years later, the Civil War came, so it was only postponed. So again, how well did they deal with it? Anything you want to add to that?
Only that it depends on how you frame the question. It said, how well did the Constitution deal with the problems of creating a new government for the USA?
Yeah.
I think I would say well on each case, including the slavery,
Yeah.
in the sense that the condition for this federal government is the agreement of all the states,
Yeah.
and including the slave states. So how do you get a basically the achievement? So if you want to look at it this way, the most positive way
Yeah.
is the achievement of the Constitution is that they managed to get the southern states on side without explicitly legitimizing slavery in the Constitution.
Yeah.
That's a pretty big achievement.
Yeah.
Now, you could argue it the other way, and there is an interpretation. I mean, there is, a very heated debate about the status of slavery in the Constitution. There is now, and there was, in the 19th century as well, right? So actually, they were arguing pretty soon after this whether, in fact, the Constitution did acknowledge slavery as a legitimate, institution or not. But I think the plain reading is that no slavery is mentioned. Slavery is not mentioned by name. So imagine a situation where there's an amendment, in the Bill of Rights that says slavery is permitted and and shall never be abolished.
Yeah.
That would be completely different, right?
Yeah, but I think if they'd have said slavery is perpetual, the northern states would not have signed up to this union. And if they'd have said slavery was to be abolished eventually, the southern states would not have signed up to this union. So they just couldn't mention it because one side or the other was not going to sign up to this if they mentioned it.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And it's interesting, the fact that the slave trading is allowed to continue for 20 years. Again, it's a bit ambiguous, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because it is effectively abolishing the slave trade. The transatlantic slave trade, it's banning the importation of slaves. So that's kind of good, but it's not doing it for 20 years.
No, but they were also worried at this point that too many slaves, there would now be the risk of a rebellion or uprising because, of course, they're looking at that it's not very long after this that the Haitian Revolution happens, and then they become petrified of this idea.
Yeah.
So they were really happy to get rid of them, and obviously this ends up with the breaking up of families. So the slave trade after that 20-year period is very different to the slave trade before they would keep more together. Now they would divide families, split them up, sell them down to worse plantations. And then, of course, that when they've got these excess slaves, they need to get rid of. That's why then the big push westward and into new territories, and whether slavery would be accepted in new territories becomes fundamentally a big question.
Yeah. So it depends on how you frame the question. If the question is how well did the Constitution balance the different interests?
Yeah.
Then I think it was very, very successful.
Yeah.
At this point, if your argument is how well did the Constitution deal with endemic problems, then you can make a much more, maybe a more ambiguous. It's more ambiguous. You could say that in fact it's failed because even though it sort of papered over the issue of slavery, in order to get compromise, it eventually did tear the country apart, and it almost ended the union. I mean, it was a pretty close run thing.
Yeah, I would say without these compromises, it would never have got ratified, and that's why it's successful. These were essential to get the ratification passed. But again, they were kicking the can down the road on a lot of issues, and they left a lot of ambiguity, especially states versus federal rights, where this was going to go. And these ended up with a lot of problems in the future. So again, a lot of these times in this time period, they're dealing with the immediate short-term effect very effectively, but they're causing long-term problems that are going to build up and explode in the future.
Yeah.